Hello, I'm Steve Morris with the Oregon Technology Business Center, and here today to talk about how to fund your startup. We present this as part of actually a much longer workshop that we do at OTBC called Startup 411. And it covers a lot of what I would call the basic startup 101 type topics, including the topic on funding. And that's, of course, the one that we'll cover today. We'll cover one of the other topics that we include in Startup 411 workshop a week from today, and that's how to set up a company, why you need a legal entity, and some of the choices that you have. And that will be presented by an emerging business attorney, Neil Nathanson, with Perkins Coie. So that'll be another great opportunity to not only get some information, but ask questions to an attorney. After I get through this, I will take a look certainly at the chat panel to see if there are any questions I can try to tackle. And one other thing to mention, I always try to remember to mention my advice on advice, which is part of the fun of being an entrepreneur is that you'll get conflicting advice from everybody, from different entrepreneurs, from investors, angels, venture capitalists. It never ends. So the fun part is you get to decide what advice is the right advice for your business. Last thing you want to do is try to do what everybody tells you to do. You'd end up with a lot of decision whiplash in that case. So advice is good to take with a grain of salt, but it's always good to take a listen because if it's from somebody who has a lot of experience, you just might learn something. So hopefully the advice in this workshop will actually be useful to you. So let's start by just providing an overview of the funding process for an early stage company, or really more of a funding strategy almost. When you're looking at funding a company, it all comes down to fundable milestones, to figuring out what milestone do you have to reach so that you can actually increase the value of your company, increase investor confidence, and get some additional funding to take the next step, the next fundable milestone. And again, we're talking here clearly about startups that are using investor funding, which a lot of growth companies do. You tend to need investor funding to fund growth. So when you're looking at a funding event, it's not just an arbitrary number. It comes down to how much money do you need to reach that next fundable milestone. Let's talk about a really simple example to try to put some reality around that concept. Let's say I get together with a couple of friends and we decided to start a company. It's a software company. Let's say none of us are programmers, so we're going to have to spend some money to develop the product. And we don't have a lot of money available, but we compare notes and we talk to some developers. It looks like maybe for $50,000 we could get a prototype developed. Okay, so where do we come up with $50,000? Well, we compare notes and we think we have enough friends and family with enough net worth that we could probably persuade them to give us that much money, but only if we do some homework. They're not going to just fund an idea. They'll want to have us go actually do some work, validate the market, talk to some customers, and come back with a pretty well thought through plan. Okay, so I've just now identified a couple of potential fundable milestones. First of all, we're saying, we're going to have to go do some customer discovery in order to get the credibility to go pitch our friends and family. How much will that cost us? Well, let's say there's three of us. We need $1,000 for living expenses for the 1 month we think it'll take us. And fortunately, we think we can all handle that with our savings being the source. Great. So we launch off and we do the customer discovery. And it takes a month. And once we do that, then we approach our friends and family and hopefully raise that $50,000. Why did we do that? Because that helps us get to the next fundable milestone of building a prototype. Why did we need a prototype? Well, with a prototype, we have something that we can show to customers, but also show potential investors that we can actually get something done. And so that gives us the credibility to go to, say, some seed funds, some very early stage investors, and raise a little more money, say $150,000, to really develop the entire product, the minimum viable product, or MVP. And why are we doing that? Well, in order to reach the next fundable milestone. If we have an MVP, we can show that to customers, get some positive feedback, And then we need to go raise some money to do a limited launch of our MVP, just to try it out, to try out our marketing campaigns. We think with the MVP and customer feedback, we can get angels to maybe fund $500,000 to do that. And based on that feedback, now we're going to tackle the next fundable milestone, which is to go raise a larger amount of money from venture capital firms to actually do a full rollout that's, say, nationwide. So again, just a really simple example of thinking milestone after milestone. One step builds on the previous step. You're creating more credibility, you're lowering the perceived risk, and opening up larger and larger sources of funding at each step of the way. So at 30,000 feet, that's just a very simple example of how a funding process might work. But the challenge is, what do you do early on in that process? You know, the reality is you need to make some headway before investors will even listen to you. And indeed, the more headway you make, the better valuation you'll get from investors. Likewise with bankers. Bankers are a lot more conservative. They'll typically want to see a couple of years of operating of revenue so that you can prove to them that whatever they're loaning you, you've got the cash flow to actually pay it back. So how do you make enough headway to get ready for either an investor or a banker when you're very early stage? Well, the stage is the key issue here. Here's a simple model of company stages. You might start with, of course, the idea, then you go do some customer discovery, see if there really is a there there. You might build a proof of concept, some kind of an early prototype, and then develop the actual product, and finally, hopefully get into revenue. So we're going to focus on those, and the rest of what we'll talk about today, in those very early stages. You have an idea, or maybe you're even in customer discovery. That's probably earlier than your typical investor will invest. So what are the sources of funding that you can tap into at that early stage? And we're going to walk through a number of them, starting with the working spouse. Now, basic idea here is if you have a spouse or a significant other and you can learn to live on one paycheck, on the spouse's paycheck, that can be great. That gives you a very long cash runway where you don't have to take a salary. Now, that's not going to fund the out-of-pocket expenses that you need to cover, but when you're doing a startup, it's extremely helpful to have a long cash runway. You can save the company a lot of money if you can afford to live without a salary. And living on your spouse's salary for a while is certainly one way to do that. So that's a very common approach you see in early stage companies. Another one, of course, also very common, is to keep your day job. That means you're basically making your startup a side project. Now, clearly, if you do that, you're going to make slower headway because you're going to work on it mainly weekends and evenings. But you're maintaining some income, and that certainly has some big advantages. Now, before an investor is going to fund you, odds are you're going to have to take that leap into actually quitting the job and doing the company full time. Otherwise, the pitch you're making to an investor is essentially, I don't really have the confidence to make the leap myself, but I really would like you to have the confidence to write a check to invest in the company. And that's an awfully tough pitch to make. It has happened. It's not impossible, but it's a pretty tough pitch to make. So at some point, you'll need to make the jump. But at least keeping your day job keeps the money coming in while you're making headway on your business. Now, another, of course, traditional source: savings, credit cards, second mortgages, and dipping into the retirement plan. Those, again, very, very common things that you dip into to fund a startup. One suggestion I would make is, especially if you're a little bit older, 50-something or later, I'd be careful about using up all that retirement savings, because a startup is a high-risk thing, and you don't want to spend your entire retirement nest egg on a startup. It's good to keep some of that in reserve. But again, these are very, very common sources of funding for a startup. Another common source, after, as per the simple example I went through, after you've made a little bit of headway, you may be able to raise some money from friends and family. Now, there are absolutely people who will suggest that you never do that. Don't raise money from friends and family because it's very risky and life will get very awkward if somehow they lose all of their money. On the other hand, frankly, there's a lot of companies that never would have started without access to that source of funding. And friends and family are the people who are the most likely to fund you because they know you and hopefully trust you. It is really important to set expectations. Let them know that, hey, this is a startup, this is risky, and be sure that they don't invest more than they could afford to lose, because that could certainly be the outcome. The other thing I always suggest, anytime you're taking money, whether it's as a loan or as an investment for a startup, this is a good time to get an attorney involved. Taking money into a company is not something you want to do the wrong way. You don't want to violate securities laws, and so using not just any attorney, but a emerging business attorney, somebody that knows the SEC rules and regs and can help you collect your funding without breaking any laws. Okay, so beyond friends and family, another option for a business-to-business play, sometimes you can fund a company with revenue from customers or partners. The idea here is you'd maybe work with a key customer, for example, negotiate some early partial payment, and you can sometimes get away with that if you have a really strong development team that the customer has confidence in. They get some real benefits. They get the product earlier than other people do, so they get the advantages of having it, and they get plenty of input into the product. Say their unfair amount of input. That can be a real plus to a customer. And of course, the benefits to the company, it's revenue, it's non-dilutive funding. So that can be a huge advantage. Now, one caution here is you're getting paid to deliver a product to a customer. And the default situation could be that the customer ends up owning the intellectual property. It's really important to make sure you have an agreement in place that says, no, you get the product first, you get to use it, but we really do need to retain in the company the rights to the intellectual property. That, for a startup, is a very important thing to own. You really do need to own your IP. So as long as you can negotiate that, customer revenue can be a great way to fund a business-to-business kind of play. Now, if you're doing something that involves technology, the federal grant programs, SBIR and STTR, are very, very good things to check into. SBIR is the Small Business Innovation Research Program. STTR is the Small Business Tech Transfer Program. These are substantial programs. I mean, more than $3 billion of funding each year. And the funding is provided either as a grant or a contract. But either way, it's not non-dilutive funding. And it's specifically for small businesses. They define small business as below 500 people. So you're not competing with the big government contractors. But the reality is most of this money goes to very small businesses, like under 10 employees. And we've definitely worked with companies that had like 2 employees and successfully obtained SBIR or STTR funding. And it's a significant amount of funding. These programs come in the grants or contracts in 2 phases. A phase 1 is typically $100,000 to $200,000, and a phase 2 is typically between $1 and $2 million. And they're specifically for product development, actually initially for feasibility studies and then product development. That's the kind of funding that's very difficult to extract from investors, which is why these programs are very important to tech startups. Really worth looking into if you're doing some kind of a technology, including even software. The challenge is just to find an agency in the federal government that's interested in or that cares about the kind of technology you're working on. The good news, there are a lot of agencies that participate in these programs, and they care about a lot of different things. And you never know. We had one company that had a medical device that got their funding from the Army. Another company that had a wind energy product that got their funding from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So you never know where it might come from. You have to be creative and do your research online. Now, there is then, of course, traditional crowdfunding, where you're typically collecting funding in return for maybe the customer getting an early version of your product. Nice thing about crowdfunding, the traditional kind, is it's non-dilutive. First of all, it's not equity. It's not. Well, in a sense, it's a debt because you're accepting money and you owe them a product back. But it's non-dilutive funding, and it combines both funding as well as customer validation. I mean, customers are paying you before you even have the product. That's a very sincere form of validating that there's a demand for your product. Now, one challenge to watch out for in doing crowdfunding is to be very careful you know what the cost is of the product that you're going to build. The product that you're going, if you underestimate your cost and you're essentially in crowdfunding, essentially selling the product for a particular price, and if it costs more than that to build it, you have a problem. And it can be a huge problem if you have just an outrageously successful crowdfunding campaign. You get committed to millions of dollars of product, but you've committed to product that will cost you more to deliver than what you charged. That gets you into trouble with the SEC, not to mention into trouble with your customers. So it is important to be careful that you really understand the costs involved in delivering what you're promising to deliver to customers, because you don't want to get in trouble. Now, there's another kind of crowdfunding, which is crowdfunding for equity, and specifically from non-accredited investors. And there are really two flavors of this. The first one would be the Title III, which is the kind of the crowdfunding bill that's a federal level program. There are some constraints on it. It limits the amount of money you can raise. It limits the amount that one investor can invest. And there are some reporting requirements that get more expensive as you close larger amounts of money. So it's good to do your homework to take a look at the pluses and minuses of that. Another potential drawback is by raising money from non-accredited investors, you're getting a lot of non-accredited investors as investors in your company. Later on, if you're going to approach traditional angels or venture capital firms for more traditional investment funding, that can be a drawback. These inexperienced, non-accredited investors can make more experienced investors nervous. And it can actually make it difficult to raise those funds. Now, there are things that you can do proactively to kind of manage, to say, legally encapsulate those non-accredited investors to make them a little less of a threat down the line. But it's a very good thing to do your homework, talk to an attorney, and make sure you raise money from non-accredited investors in a way that's not going to hurt you down the line. Now, there are also crowdfunding for equity state exemptions. For example, in Oregon, it's the Oregon Community Public Offering. A number of other states take advantage and also offer programs. Of course, they're all a little bit different. But typically, in a state exemption, if you're raising money under that exemption, you're only raising money from people who live in that state. Again, it's very much a state-specific exemption from the SEC. So you can, in the case of Oregon, you could only approach a person to talk about investment after you know that they indeed are an Oregonian. There are limits on the size of the round, limits on how much one investor can invest, and there are some reporting requirements, although not nearly as expensive as the Title III, the federal program, can involve. But the same potential drawback is you could end up with a lot of non-accredited investors, which down the road could be a problem. Now, by the way, if this is the only investor funding you're going to raise, maybe you're a local service company, a restaurant, ice cream shop, whatever, and you're never going to go after traditional angels or venture capital firms, then having non-accredited investors is really maybe not that big of an issue. But again, if you'll pursue more traditional funding down the road, it's good to be careful in the way that you raise money from non-accredited investors. Now, another category would be seed funds. These are funds that specifically invest very early, and in some cases certainly earlier than your typical angel investor would. And in some cases, these are partly funded from public sources, government sources. For example, at OTBC, each year we do the Beaverton Startup Challenge. We select 5 companies and invest $25,000 in each of them. A fair chunk of that investment fund actually is funneled through OTBC from the city of Beaverton, who looks at it as an economic development investment. But that money is more than matched by a group of angel investors. Now, in other cases, there are seed funds that are completely funded by private entities. These tend to be relatively small investments, maybe 20,000, 10 to 20 even on the lower side, up to maybe 120,000 or even a little bit more when you get into things like Y Combinator and Techstars. They are all very competitive. So that is one drawback. Only a fairly small fraction of people that apply actually receive these funds. But if you've got a strong idea, a strong team, and you can make a strong pitch, a seed fund is certainly a possible early stage source of funding. So that is a quick summary of a lot of different sources. Now, if you have any questions, certainly please go ahead and post them in the chat room, and I'll see if I can tackle them. But again, quick summary. The working spouse, boy, at least that gives you potentially a very long cash runway, which is hugely helpful. Keeping the day job, of course, it slows you down, but it's a very practical way to fund a company. Using savings, credit cards, loans, second mortgages, retirement funds, those are all the traditional sources. You just have to use some judgment as to how deep you want to get into debt or into your savings. Friends and family, again, be careful, but it can be a very important source of funding for an early stage startup. And revenue from customers, also a great way to do it. Typically, that's a B2B play, although really it's essentially what you're doing with traditional crowdfunding. Also, it's revenue from customers, and in that case, that's usually more of a consumer type play. Don't forget the grant programs. Again, if you're doing any kind of technology, SBIR, STTR is a very good thing to know about. Yeah, there's a lot of red tape involved in applying, but it's non-dilutive funding, and funding that actually will fund high-risk, early-stage R&D type projects. Then your traditional crowdfunding, the Kickstarter types, and so forth, and the relatively newer option of crowdfunding for equity, and then finally you've got the seed funds. So those are that's a quick rundown of some of the sources of funding for a very early stage startup. And I'm going to switch over here to take a look at the chat room and see if we have anything going on there. All right, and not seeing any questions at this point. So, gosh, this might be easy. That's really it for now. And we're lacking any questions. If you do come up with questions, I'm always happy to try to tackle them. We're just starting to get a little more action. Question from Alicia. In the very early in developing, she's very early in developing a natural food store in the rural Eastern Oregon community. Does the type of business affect who and what entity will fund? For example, LLC, sole proprietorship, or so forth. Well, potentially yes and no. In terms of the type of entity. And again, type of entity we'll talk about a lot more a week from today. But your typical, a really typical first investment from an investor would be in the form of a convertible note. And in that case, the type of entity isn't really critical. It could be an LLC, it could be a corporation. Usually not a sole proprietor if you're looking for investment. Usually companies are looking for a company, a legal entity to invest in, not a sole proprietor. But that early stage investment, yeah, especially if it's formed as a either convertible note or a SAFE, a simple agreement for future equity, that can be a way to fund either an LLC or a C corp. Now there are of course different tax treatments for LLCs versus C corps versus S corps, and we'll certainly get into that a little bit more next week when there's an attorney to ask questions to. Let's see. We have a question from Bobby. Are there any business development programs coming out of the CARES Act? I know most of the PPP, the Payroll Protection Program, is focused on conserving businesses, but to any help with hiring? The parts of the CARES program, and again in response to the coronavirus, that I've seen are more focused on things like the PPP, on helping people retain the employees that they have now, even though business levels are very low. I'm not aware so much of development funds coming out of that program. On the other hand, frankly, things change day to day in those programs, so it's certainly good to seek out blogs and sources of information on that. Business Oregon actually for Oregon has some good information online, keeping track of resources for businesses. And of course, there's going to be more funding. There are going to be more bills. There are going to be more programs, and a lot of it will certainly be focused on helping smaller businesses succeed. So I'd keep my eyes open and ears open for future developments in that area. And let's see. I'll mention here quickly, if you have additional questions, happy to try to tackle them by email. You can send them just to smorris, SMORRIS, at otbc.org, and certainly try to respond to those. And aside from that, since I'm not seeing a lot more in the way of questions, I think we will wrap this up for now. Again, keep in mind, 1 week from today, next Tuesday at noon, we'll have the program on the reasons that you need a legal entity and things to think about in choosing what type of entity. So hope you'll stay tuned. Actually, you can simply subscribe to the channel and click on the little bell for notification. You'll be sure and get notified that way of that upcoming live stream if you're not already on the email list. Let's see. And Powell said, no question, just appreciate the content. And thank you. And again, hopefully it's useful. I think you will find the business entity discussion next time to be very, very helpful too. So I think that is it for now. Again, thank you very much for tuning in, and with a little bit of luck, we'll see you next week.